The Little Singing Kettle. Curly the Pixie lived all by himself in Twisty Cottage. His cottage stood at the end of the village of How and was always very neatly kept. It had blue and yellow curtains at the window and blue and yellow flowers in the garden. So you can guess how pretty and trim it was. Curly was a mean pixie. He was the meanest pixie that ever lived, but he always pretended to be very generous indeed. If he had a bag of peppermints, he never let anyone see it, but put it straight into his pocket till he got home. And if he met any of the other pixies, he would pull a long face and say, "If only I had a bag of sweets, I would offer you one." "Never mind," the other said. "It's nice of you to think of it." And off they went, saying what a nice, generous creature Curly was. Now one day, as Curly was walking home along Dimty Lane, where the trees met overhead, so that it was just like walking in a green tunnel, he saw a strange fellow in front of him. This was the Humpy Goblin, and he carried a great many saucepans, kettles, and pans, all slung down his back, round his shoulders, and over his chest. They made a great noise as he walked, but louder than the noise was the Humpy Goblin's voice. He sang all the time in a voice like a cracked bell. "Do you want a saucepan, kettle, or pan? If you do, here's the Goblin Man, the Humpy Goblin with his load of pots and pans is down the road. Hey, 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 here's the Goblin Man. Do you want a saucepan, kettle, or pan?" Now, Curly badly wanted a new kettle because his own had a hole in it and the water leaked over his stove each day, making a funny hissing noise. So he ran after the Goblin Man and called him. The Humpy Goblin turned round and grinned. He was a cheerful fellow, always pleased to see anybody. "I want a good little kettle, nice and cheap," said Curly. "I've got just the one for you," said the Humpy Goblin, and he pointed to a bright little kettle on his back. Curly looked at it. "How much is it?" he asked. "6 silver pennies," said the Goblin. This was quite cheap, but mean old Curly wasn't going to give 6 silver pennies for the kettle. He pretended to be shocked at the price, and then he gave a huge sigh. "Oh, I'm not rich enough to pay all that," he said sadly. "I can only pay 3 silver pennies." "Oh no," said the Humpy Goblin firmly. 3 silver pennies isn't enough. It costs 6 silver pennies. Well, they stood and talked to one another for a long time, one saying 6 silver pennies and the other saying 3 silver pennies, until at last the Humpy Goblin laughed in Curly's face and walked off, jingling all his kettles and pans. "You're a mean old stick," he called after Curly. "I'm not going to sell you anything. Goodbye, Mr. Mean." Off he went and soon began to sing his song again. Curly heard him. "Do you want a saucepan, kettle, or pan? If you do, here's the Goblin Man." Curly stood and watched him angrily. Then he started walking too. He had to follow the Goblin Man because that was the way home to Twisty Cottage. But he took care not to follow too close, for he was afraid that the Humpy Goblin might call something rude after him. It was a hot day and the Goblin was tired. After a while he thought he would sit down in the hedge and rest. So down he sat, and it wasn't more than a minute before he was sound asleep and snoring. Curly heard him and knew he must be asleep. A naughty thought slipped into his head. I wonder if I could take that kettle from him while he's asleep. I could leave 3 silver pennies beside him to pay for it. How cross he would be when he woke up to find that I had got the kettle for 3 silver pennies after all. He crept up to the humpy goblin. He certainly was sound asleep with his mouth so wide open that it was a good thing there wasn't anything above his head that could drop into it. Curly carefully undid the little shining kettle without making even a clink of noise. Then he put 3 bright pennies on the grass beside the goblin and ran off, chuckling to himself for being so smart. He soon reached home. He filled the little kettle with water and put it on the stove. It really was a dear little thing, and it boiled very quickly indeed, sending a spurt of steam out of the spout almost before Curly had got out the teapot to make the tea. Just as he sat down to enjoy a cup of tea and a piece of cake, someone walked up his garden path and looked in at the door. It was the humpy goblin. When he saw that Curly had the kettle on the fire, he grinned all over his face. "So, you have got it," he said. "Well, much good may it do to you. Kettle, listen to me. Teach Mr. Curly the lesson he needs." "Ho, ho, Curly, you can keep the kettle. I don't want it." Laughing and skipping, the goblin went down the path again. Curly felt a bit uncomfortable. What was he laughing like that for? "Oh, he just tried to frighten me and make me think something nasty would happen," said Curly to himself. "Silly old goblin." He cleared away his cup and saucer and filled up the kettle again. He was washing up the dirty dishes when a knock came at his door, and Dame Pitpat looked in. "I say, Curly, could you let me have a little tea? I have emptied my tin and it's such a long way to the shops." Now Curly had a whole tin full, but he wasn't going to let Dame Pitpat have any. He ran to the dresser and took down a tin he knew was empty. "Yes, certainly, Dame Pitpat," he said. "You shall have some of my tea." "Oh dear, the tin's empty. What a pity. You could have had half of it, if only I'd had any. But I must have used it all up." Dame Pitpat looked at the empty tin. Then she turned to go. "I'm sorry I bothered you, Curly," she said. "It was kind of you to say I could have half, if only you'd had any tea." Then a funny thing happened. The little kettle on the stove sent out a big spurt of steam and began to sing a shrill song. "Mr. Curly has plenty of tea. He's just as mean as a pixie can be. Look in the tin on the left of the shelf and see what a lot he has for himself." Then the kettle took another breath and shouted, "Mean old thing! Stingy old thing! Oh, look at him!" Dame Pitpat was so astonished that she stood gaping for quite a minute. She couldn't think where the song came from. She had no idea it was the kettle on the stove, but Curly knew it was. He was so angry and ashamed that he could have cried. Dame Pit-Pat went to the shelf and took down the tin that stood on the left. She opened it, and sure enough, it was full of tea to the brim. "Oh, look at this," she said. "Well, Curly, you said I could have half of any tea you had, so I shall take you at your word. Thanks very much." She emptied half the tea out into the tin she had bought and went out of the cottage, looking round curiously to see if she could spy who had sung that song about Curly. But she didn't think of looking in the kettle, of course. Curly was so angry with the kettle that he decided to beat it with a stick. But before he could do that, someone poked his head in at the window and called him. "Mr. Curly, will you lend me your umbrella, please? I've lost mine and it's raining." It was little Capers, the pixie who lived next door. He was always lending Curly things, and now he had come to borrow something himself. But Curly was in a very bad temper. "My umbrella's lost too," he said. "I'm so sorry, Capers. You could have it if only I had it myself, but it's gone." "Oh well, never mind," said Capers. "It's nice of you to say you would have lent it to me." Before he could go, the shining kettle gave a tiny hop on the stove and began to sing again. "Mr. Curly has got an umbrella. He's such a mean and stingy fella. He says he hasn't got one at all, but just you go and look in the hall." Then it took another breath and began to shout again at the top of its steamy voice. "Mean old thing, stingy old thing. Oh, look at him." Capers was so surprised to hear this song that he nearly fell in through the window. He stared at Curly, who was looking as black as thunder and as red as a beetroot. Then Capers looked through the kitchen door into the tiny hall, and sure enough, Curly's green umbrella stood there. Capers jumped in at the window and fetched the umbrella. He waved it at Curly. "You said I could have it if only you had got it," he cried. "Here it is, so I'll borrow it. Many thanks." He ran off and left Curly nearly crying with rage. The pixie caught up the stick and ran to beat the kettle, but that small kettle was far too quick for him. It rose up in the air and put itself high up on a shelf for safety. Then it poured just a drop of boiling water onto Curly's hand, which made the pixie dance and shout with pain. "You wait till I get you," cried Curly, shaking his stick. Someone knocked at his front door. Curly opened it. Rag and Tag, the two gnomes, stood there smiling. "Curly, we are collecting pennies for poor Mr. Thumble, whose house burned down yesterday," they said. "You're so generous that we thought you would be sure to give us one." Curly knew there was no money in his pockets, so he pulled them inside out quickly, saying, "Oh yes, you shall have whatever money I have." Rag and Tag, "Goodness, there's none in this pocket and none in that. How unfortunate! I haven't any pennies to give you, and I should have been so pleased to have let you have all I had." "Well, that's very nice of you to say so," said Dragon Tag. "Never mind. Thank you very much for trying to be generous." Before they could go, that little kettle was singing again, spurting out great clouds of steam as it did so. Although he says he hasn't any, Curly's got a silver penny. Look in his purse on the table there and take the money he well can spare. Then, taking another breath, the kettle shouted with all his might, "Mean old thing, stingy old thing, oh, look at him!" Rag and Tag stared all around the kitchen to see where the voice came from, but they couldn't see anyone. But Curly, it couldn't be the pixie singing. Surely? No, he looked too angry and ashamed to sing anything. The gnomes saw the purse lying on the table and they ran for it. Inside was a silver penny. They took it and put it into their box. "Well, Curly," they said, "you said we might have any pennies you had. If you'd had any, and you have, so we'll take this silver one. Goodbye." Out they went giggling together, wondering who it was in the cottage that had given Curly away. As for Curly, he was so angry that he caught up a jug of milk and flung it straight at the kettle, which was still high up on the shelf. Crash! The kettle hopped aside and the jug broke in a dozen pieces against the wall behind. The milk spilled and splashed all over Curly. Then the kettle began to laugh. How it laughed! It was funny, wheezy laugh, but you can't think how angry it made Curly. He took up a hammer and flung that at the kettle too, but once more it slipped to one side and oh dear me, a lovely big jar of plum jam up on the shelf was smashed. It all splashed down onto Curly. So what? With milk and jam, he was a fine sight. The kettle nearly killed itself with laughing. It almost fell off the shelf. Curly went and washed himself under the tap. He felt frightened. What was he going to do with that awful singing kettle? He must get rid of it somehow, or it would tell everyone the most dreadful tales about him. "I'll wait till tonight," thought Curly. "Then, when it's asleep, I'll take it and throw it away." So he took no more notice of the kettle, and as no other visitors came that day, the kettle was fairly quiet, except that sometimes it would suddenly shout, "Mean old thing, stingy old thing, oh, look at him." Then Curly would almost jump out of his skin with fright and glare at the kettle angrily. At 9 o'clock, Curly went to bed. The kettle hopped down to the stove and went to sleep. Curly waited for a little while and then he crept out of bed. He went to the stove and took hold of the kettle. Ah, he had it now. The kettle woke up and shouted, but Curly had it by the handle. The water in it was no longer hot, so it could not hurt Curly. The pixie hurried outside with the kettle and went to the bottom of his garden. There was a rubbish heap there. The pixie stuffed the struggling kettle right into the middle. He left it there and went back, delighted. He climbed into bed and fell asleep. But at midnight, something woke him by tapping at the window. "Let me in," cried a voice. "Let me in. I'm dirty and I want washing." "That's that horrid kettle," thought Curly in a fright. "Well, it can go on tapping. I won't let it in." But the kettle tapped, and at last it flung itself hard against the glass, broke it, and came in through the hole. It went over to Curly's bed and stood itself there. "Wash me," it said. "I'm dirty and smelly. You shouldn't have put me on that nasty rubbish heap." "Get off my nice clean bed," cried Curly angrily. "Look what a mess you're making." But the kettle wouldn't get off, and in the end, the angry pixie had to get up and wash the kettle till it was clean again. Then he banged it down on the stove and left it. Next day, the kettle sang songs about him again, and Curly kept hearing it shout, "Mean old fellow! Stingy old fellow! Oh, look at him!" till he was tired of it. So many people had heard about the strange things happening in the pixie's cottage that all day long visitors came to ask for different things, and poor Curly was nearly worried out of his life. "I'll drown that kettle in my well tonight," he thought. So once more he took the kettle when it was asleep and threw it down the well. Splash! Ha! It wouldn't get out of there in a hurry. But about 3 o'clock in the morning, there came a tap, tap, tap at the window, which had now been mended. It was the kettle back again. "Curly, let me in. I'm cold and wet. Let me in." Curly was afraid his window would be broken again, so he jumped out of bed and let in the shivering kettle. To his horror, it crept into bed with him and wouldn't go away. "It was cold and wet in the well," said the kettle. "Warm me, Curly." So Curly had to warm the kettle, and how angry he was. It was so uncomfortable to sleep with a kettle, especially one that kept sticking its sharp spout into him. But he had to put up with it. In the morning, he put the kettle back on the stove and started to think hard while he had his breakfast. "I can't get rid of that kettle," he said to himself. "And while it's here, it's sure to sing horrid things about me every time anyone comes to borrow something. I wonder what it would do if I let people have what they ask for. I'll try and see." So when Mother Homie came and begged for a bit of soup because she had run out of it and the shops were closed that afternoon, Curly gave her a whole new piece without making any excuse at all. Mother Homie was surprised and delighted. "Thank you so much," she said. "You're a kind soul, Curly." The kettle said nothing at all, not a single word. As for Curly, he suddenly felt very nice inside. It was lovely to give somebody something. It made him feel warm and kind. He made up his mind to do it again to see if he felt nice the next time and to see if that wretched kettle said anything. He soon found that the kettle said never a word unless he was mean or untruthful. And he found too that it was lovely to be kind and to give things away. It was nice even to lend them. "I have been horrid and nasty," thought Curly to himself. I'll turn over a new leaf and try to be different. And that old kettle can say what it likes. Anyway, it boils very quickly and makes a lovely pot of tea. Very soon, the kettle found little to say, for Curly became kind and generous. Once or twice he forgot, but as soon as he heard the kettle beginning to speak, he quickly remembered, and the kettle stopped its song. And one day, who should peep in at the door but the humpy goblin, grinning all over his face as usual. "Hello, Curly," he said. "How did you like the kettle? Was it cheap for 3 silver pennies? I've come to take it back if you want to get rid of it. It was a mean trick to play on you, really, but I think you deserved it." Curly looked at the smiling goblin. Then he took his purse from his pocket and found 3 silver pennies. He held them out to Humpy Goblin. "Here you are," he said. "You wanted 6 silver pennies for the kettle, and I was mean enough to leave you only 3. Here's the other 3. But don't you want to give me back the kettle?" asked the Humpy Goblin in surprise. "I left a horrid singing spell in it." "Yes, I know," said Curly, "but I deserved it. I'm different now. I like the kettle too. We are great friends. I try to be kind now. So the kettle doesn't sing nasty things about me. It just hums nice, friendly little songs." Well, wonders will never end," said the Goblin man, astonished. "Don't bother about the other 3 silver pennies, Curly. I don't want them." "Well, if you won't take them, let me offer you a cup of tea made from water boiled in the singing kettle," said Curly. The Humpy Goblin was even more astonished to hear the pixie being so kind, but he sat down at the table in delight. Then he and Curly had a cup of tea, each and a large slice of ginger cake, and they talked together and found that they liked one another very much indeed. So now Curly and the Humpy Goblin are the very greatest friends, and the little singing kettle hums its loudest when it boils water for their tea. You should just hear it.